This is America Daily, bringing you the best in truthful news updates and in-depth reports happening now.
The problems we're seeing now is not Democrat versus Republican. It's the Marxist influence in this country. I think everybody can get behind trying to solve that issue. Then I think we as a country can move forward from this chapter.
Welcome to America Daily. I'm Jessica Beatty. Conventional wisdom states that you can accomplish more as a team than you can on your own. From that, it would seem that it's better for countries to be unified than to be divided. Yet, the United States is extremely divided today. How did this happen? And is there a way for us to unify? Today, we welcome back contributor Timothy Gebhart to get his take on these questions and possible solutions. Tim, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
So, what do you think is behind this division?
One of the main reasons when we look at it, there's obviously the political parties. That's one of the most obvious. Behind that, though, there's a cultural difference that I think with anything, culture comes first before politics. Politics reacts to culture. So in this sense, we're seeing this actually playing out internationally. There's what is now, the globalist Marxist camp, I guess, and then the nationalist traditionalist movement. So in the United States, at least, we see, it comes across as the Democrat versus Republican Party, but we're seeing scholars saying that there's a shift in the ideological affiliations. So again, there's the nationalist traditionalists, and then also there's the globalist Marxist movements, and this is playing out internationally as we see. So the division there, again, is mostly cultural. There's the nationalist traditionalists who want to conserve our identities as nations and what they stand upon, getting back to traditional mores and values that have sustained society for thousands of years at this point. And this is largely a reaction to the globalist Marxist movement. I'll get into this, why it's reaction, but the globalist Marxist movement is basically, at its core, its principles are based on struggle. So if you look at Lenin in Soviet Russia, you look at Mao, Chairman Mao in China, you look at all these communist leaders, what they have in common is the belief in dialectical materialism. So what that is, it's basically a ideology of struggle. Whereas, and this is going back to the early 19th century with Charles Darwin. They based a lot of dialectical materialism off of his beliefs, where there's always an evolution. And what the communists liked about Charles Darwin's theory is that they thought it took God out of the picture. And so human beings were basically seen as material without any kind of soul, so to speak. Like in dialectical materialism, the only focus is on the physical material world. There's really no highlighting of any kind of morality in that situation, like traditional morality. So what dialectical materialism wants to do is basically, and this is something you see when Lenin was leader of the Soviet Union. He went to Pavlov, he did the dog study, the drooling dog study. And he wanted to apply that to human beings because he thought they were nothing more than animals. And so he wanted people to basically respond and react in exactly the same way, across the board, because humans are just these animals. They're easy to control. And oftentimes you struggle to do that. So anyways, back to my point, with the Marxists, we see their worldview is based on struggle, and it's also, based on atheism. And then, so they were heavily pushing these ideologies, throughout most of the 20th century. And we see a lot of the effects of that, where millions of people are basically dying and starving to death because of these policies. In China, even when the Chinese Communist Party took over, they adopted Charles Darwin's theories. Actually, that was before that. In the 1930s, that started to become fairly popular with intellectuals. all of a sudden we see like a lot of the breakdown of society, like almost instantly. So it's basically these ideologies that lead people to abandon tradition. So, and then you have nationalist traditionalists on the other side who are reacting to the extremes of a globalist Marxist movement. So, before what we see in the United States, at least up until recent, is that the two political parties could, in many ways, function together. We would have these elections where it would be one side or the other, major blowout elections where a Democrat would vote Republican, et cetera, because the core ideology was based in traditionalism. And then during the 60s, we see this shift towards, well, the Marxists, they wanted to take over one or more of the political parties in the United States. They succeeded with the Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party now is not what it was prior to the 60s. They were for workers' rights. Traditionally, fair representation, human rights was a big issue in the Democratic Party. That's switched. On the surface, it seems the same, but underneath, there's the underlying tone of Marxist ideology. So we get workers' rights, and that has switched to minority rights, and human rights is basically what touts the party line. So anything from immigration is now a human right, things like that. So fair representation, again, that goes into the minorities. And basically, this is what they're doing is using dialectical materialism in this sense, where there's always an evolution of things. And to get that evolution, there needs to be struggle. And the end goal of the struggle is to reach communism. So they're basically pitting, and we saw this during the Obama administration, basically. They really highlighted what you're seeing as police brutality towards minority groups, when essentially it was a campaign to heighten the divide between two groups of people to push a communist agenda. So in this sense, we can look at it and say, well, the nationalist traditionalists are going to react in the opposite way by further adopting a traditionalist narrative in that case. And so what we see is basically the polar opposites, we're getting further and apart. And this is creating a lot of division.
Yeah, and it seems like everywhere you look, there's some kind of struggle. And there's another take on this that I think's interesting. I don't know if you've heard of Tom Del Beccaro's book called The Divided Era, but he's basically saying that our government has gotten so big that everything has become political, and the government picks who wins and who loses, and then who gets what, There's a lot more at stake now. And this wasn't such a big issue when the nation was founded because, the government was a lot smaller. And now it's almost like we rely on the federal government more and the state and local governments less. But we are seeing some really positive things happening now. For instance, the activist Scott Pressler, the young conservative man who's organizing the large-scale trash cleanups in Baltimore and California. So you'd think that this stuff would be taken care of by their local government, but, he's the one going in and getting volunteers together. I think he's inspiring a lot of people that no matter whether you're Democrat or Republican, that we can help our neighbors and work together to accomplish something. So I think he's inspiring people to do something instead of just talking about it. I think that's a great unifying force.
What's interesting about all that is there's a lot of talk about free stuff, and this is part of the new globalist Marxist. It's always been a platform of theirs. You can see this with Bernie Sanders and, running for the presidential nomination. But what they do basically, and this is communism 101, is they offer tons of free stuff. And that way, it's in effect giving more power to the government because they're taking the wealth from the populace and then redistributing it as free education, but now it is under government control. So all of the higher institutions would be under government control in the case of free education. Healthcare would be completely under government control if we had, free healthcare. So there's a massive amount of issues with that because it's centralizing the government. And so basically, and then you have the opposite reaction of that with the national traditionalists that want to stay true to the Constitution, because if we adopted these socialist policies, that would basically be undermining the Constitution at every turn, which is the Marxist goal, of course. And getting back to the divide, how we can basically see this also is that, with culture especially, it's nearly impossible to have these kind of conciliatory and compromising viewpoints, because if you look at Marxism, it basically wants to completely erase tradition. With the family, that's one of the goals, is to erase family values, traditional morality. And this is especially true with Christianity. And prior to World War One, Germany was de-Christianized. The Marxist kind of ideologies were very prevalent. They spread through the intellectual class in Germany prior to World War One, and it pretty much brought this kind of nihilism, materialism to the populace. And a lot of that led to World War One, and then World War Two, when Hitler took over. Nobody was there to really question him. They didn't have the Christian morality to go against the grain of what Hitler was doing. Killing mass amounts of people kind of goes against the love thy neighbor belief. Hitler was extremely just ruthless, and it goes completely against Christian doctrine. So if Germany still had its Christian roots, we would not have seen World War II. When we look at it now, the two parties cannot come together because under Marxist ideology, we would basically be put into a communist system. Is that where we want to go? So if we look at history, I don't think so.
Another thing that I think is interesting is that there's this push for socialism, but I don't think a lot of people really realize that it's actually a very specific political and economic system where the government controls the means of production and the distribution of goods. So I think it would be difficult for the government to be able to figure out what's best for everybody. It's so hard to keep track of everything, whereas you as an individual know exactly what you need for your day-to-day needs. And there's this idea that socialism is the compassionate way to take care of people, and that the Nordic model is socialist, but I think over there they actually call it compassionate capitalism. So I don't know. For me personally, I don't really like it when people try to micromanage my life, and I feel like that's kind of what would happen if these policies would be adopted here. Oh yeah, and did you read the transcript of the Ukraine phone call?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, we're seeing all this play out now with the whistleblower complaint and, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi launched the impeachment inquiry on Tuesday. And then a few hours later, the transcript of the phone call between President Trump and Ukrainian president was made public. And so basically, President Trump was calling to congratulate Ukraine's president for his party winning the parliamentary election. And then Zelensky said that they learned a lot from Trump's election and that they're trying to drain the swamp in Ukraine too. And then President Trump asked for the favor, saying that CrowdStrike has the Hillary Clinton email server and if they could get some help with that. And also that Joe Biden shut down a Ukrainian prosecutor for prosecuting his son. So it's just really interesting to see this playing out in different countries right now, kind of weeding out the corrupt people and focusing on what's best for their own nations.
Yeah, and a lot of that kind of goes back into the basis of what people are concerned about now. A lot of it is, of course, on the economy. There's a lot of border security, and this is in Western Europe, also the United States. There's a big issue with border security, particularly Western Europe, where they've had millions upon millions of people from Africa and the Middle East flooding into, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, etc. And they're already overpopulated. Their systems are already completely maxed out. And so this is putting a lot of strain on a lot of the infrastructure of those countries, and also culturally too, because the governments are setting up, they're basically trying to erase the native populations, forcibly erasing the culture and replacing it with, this kind of hodgepodge of modernism and Islam, which doesn't do anybody any favors in that case. It doesn't do the Muslims any kind of benefit, and also the culture there, it doesn't do any benefit. They're basically saying a modernist culture, which is materialism, going back to communism. So the globalists, in this sense, they're adopting communist policies, and what they're doing is the populations of these countries, they're putting border security they're making it, the main issue. And we see these Marxist globalist countries losing their foothold one by one. So, for example, Italy with Matteo Salvini, Ukraine, another one that you just talked about, and the Netherlands, I think, has recently voted a lot of these nationalist traditionalists, just all across, even Greece now. So it's spreading, and it goes back to these securities of economic security, border security, also cultural security. So in the United States, we see the same thing. And so people, first and foremost, they want to feel like they're being taken care of, the government's doing the right thing, they have their needs and interests in mind. So going back to security, yeah, you want to have, a nice secure place to raise your family. You want to have cultural roots that aren't extreme. You want to have a good economy. So then you can live a prosperous, healthy life. And the Marxists are taking us away from that. So we're seeing a massive shift because the globalists have gotten so extreme, towards the nationalist traditionalists. And this is just going to keep growing as the Marxist globalists get more and more extreme, as we're seeing in the United States right now. So with the political divide, it's basically where you can say the Democratic Party has been taken over by the globalist Marxist movement. So if you have people that are very in line with the Democratic Party, you can kind of explain it that way, where it's not the Democratic Party that's the problem, it's the Marxist influence. So I think if we can get behind that and say the problems we're seeing now, it's not Democrat versus Republican, it's the Marxist influence in this country. And really, I think everybody can get behind trying to solve that issue. Then I think we as a country can move forward from all of this, from this chapter.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I interviewed Brad Johnson. He's a retired CIA guy, and he was talking about how the Democrat 2020 hopefuls are so radical, and that they have to be for the primaries, because the people who vote in the primaries are more radical than normal voters. So the Democratic Party has really changed a lot from what it was traditionally. And so the Democrats are trying to attract these radical people for their primaries, and then afterwards they'll have to walk it back so they can attract normal voters. So I thought that was interesting. That's probably why we're seeing them adopt so many radical policies in these debates.
Yeah, and a lot of this comes from the media too, which are mostly owned by the globalist Marxists. Take the New York Times. So there's 5 major companies in the United States that own basically, all the media in the United States. 4 or 5 which are heavily influenced by globalist Marxist ideologies. So you look at, CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, media companies like that. Some of the language they use is, I'm not sure how people can really take it, seriously. Like, CNN, people saying, oh, well, white heterosexual men are the biggest problem in this country. That should raise some eyebrows. And that should tell people, what their values are. Even, with the abortion issue, celebrating day before birth abortions. We see this with Bernie Sanders too. When he was asked about what to do about climate change, he kind of gaffed and said, well, abortion. These are communist ideologies being spewed through the media. And what this takes us is going back to dialectical materialism, basically through struggle. People are nothing more than material objects. The soul doesn't matter, not there. So people are placing emphasis on the here and now and power struggles. So in the Marxist ideologies, we see these struggles, and the media is using that narrative. So, as long as the media, they're losing massive amounts of money every year, but there again, they have behind them these billionaires funding them. That's the only way they can stay afloat at this point. So as long as that's intact, I still think this is going to be a major issue. So I think, independent media, small channels, they really play an important role at this point in time to put out a different message that isn't this Marxist ideology, so people can see it for what it is and know that what they're trying to do is be divisive.
Yeah, and this kind of goes back to your interview with Clifford Humphrey about the 1619 Project. And a point you guys made that I thought was really good is that, yeah, there are a lot of things that they're talking about in this project that are very important and they should be brought up. There have been a lot of injustices in our country's history, but they don't give a solution, So it's just inciting anger instead of offering solutions or how we can move past it. So, how can we make things better for all Americans? And that's what I'm realizing even more, is that a lot of these things that the media stirs up is just trying to make people angry, and there's no rational dialogue or trying to give options or solutions. They're just trying to divide us even more.
Yeah, and what they do, they're playing on people's good natures to do all this, and that's what's most disheartening about this, is where people are, generally very kind. They want to see other people succeed. They want to see everybody have a good life, kind of thing. They want oppressed people to be represented. These are all good things. People are generally very good at the core. And so what the Marxists are doing in this case, which I think is just terrible, is they're using people's good natures to push the agenda of struggle. And after a certain amount of time, what happens is that people get very negative and cynical because they're constantly being harangued about, being oppressed. These people are being oppressed. This isn't functioning. Everything is trying to put them down. So you got to do this. You have to fight for this. You have to struggle against that. You have to completely scrap the system and replace it with, our policies, kind of thing.
So what do you think the solution is?
Yeah, again, it's the main culprit here, I think, is the media again, where it's, if we can recognize what the media is trying to do, then, I think we can be a little more cynical about it and understand that, what they're doing has a purpose, and that purpose is to create struggle, this constant narrative of struggle in the United States. And it doesn't bring us to a place we want to go. It brings us to division between people in the United States, a hostile environment, basically. So I think what we can do at this point in time is to recognize that the media is not playing a healthy role in this, and we should maybe be good to understand that and distances ourselves from it, which I think people are doing in mass because they're just so tired of the constant negativity. And the media is a major informant of culture. That's, we want to know what's going on around the world, so we turn to the news, but it's not news anymore. It's basically 24/7 propaganda pitches. And the more all this stuff is coming out, the more people realize it. And, it's just a matter of time. The thing with communism in the United States, they could not take this country via force, physical force. So they're doing it via culture and everything like that. It's harder to detect, but still, as long as there's an opposition to it, it makes it extremely difficult for them to take the root of this country, because they will never succeed if people are having these kinds of conversations, kind of exposing what they're trying to do, which is basically erase tradition. They're trying to scrap everything in the United States, our values and everything like that. The human condition basically would be turned to basically cogs in a wheel to satisfy the state. So as long as there's an opposition to that, and independent media, people having these conversations and really understanding what's going on, it will build, and a different narrative will take place. And right now, they're trying to control that narrative as much as they can, but I don't think in the end they will succeed there, because the Marxists have pushed so far to the extreme their agenda and their ideologies that there is a opposite reaction. So people are really trying to take stock in traditional values and things like that, the bedrock of what made our civilization what it is, where we can have millions of people that want to come to this country because there's prosperity here, there's stability, emphasis on stability, because they're based on traditional values. There's morality, and morality is the greatest wealth a country can have. If we have as a culture a valuing of traditional morality, that creates a foundation for a flourishing society. Any country that doesn't have that, as we've seen when communism takes over, it turns into a slaughterhouse. So what's good about this is that people are reacting by really emphasizing these traditional values that I think have been taken for granted. 1950s, 60s on up, parents didn't tell their children why they're important, maybe because they didn't need to. It was just kind of, these things were taken for granted, and now they're not. They're to be taken very seriously, and we're having these types of narratives being put out that I think there's room for optimism and hope there.
That's a great way to end. Thank you so much, Tim, for sharing your thoughts on this.
Oh yeah, thank you for having me.
This is America Daily, bringing you the best in truthful news updates and in-depth reports happening now.